A D.C. woman who's mourning the death of her husband says paramedics took too long to respond. She's been looking for answers for months and not getting a response. So she asked the News 4i team for help, and Tisha Thompson went straight to the fire chief.
Through good times and bad, Loretta and Derek Wheeler raised 7 kids and battled his kidney disease and asthma.
We've been married 23 years.
On the night of December 6th, Derek started having trouble breathing. Loretta says she hit a medical alert button to call 911 at 8:51. According to documents obtained by the News 4i team, 911 dispatched an ambulance 1 minute later.
And then he said, "Loretta, don't leave me. I can't breathe." And then I said, "I'm not." And the next minute I turned around and he slumped over.
Loretta started CPR and hit the button again at 8:55. Desperate to save her husband, she continued compressions as minutes ticked by. Her neighbor called 911 around 8:59. Medical experts like the Mayo Clinic say time is critical with an unconscious person who isn't breathing because death or permanent brain damage can occur within 4 to 6 minutes. The internal records show the first ambulance showed up 10 minutes after being dispatched, but that crew did not have a paramedic and couldn't do what's called advanced life support. Instead, they took over CPR and called for a second unit. It arrived at 9:11, 20 minutes after Loretta first called.
They did everything they could to save this man's life.
D.C. Fire Chief Ken Ellerby says the units did their job that night, working on the scene for almost an hour to get a pulse before transporting him to Washington Hospital Center, where doctors placed Derek Wheeler on life support. The 53-year-old died 5 days later. His widow wonders why that first responding ambulance did not have what it needed to save her husband.
If I knew that there was a problem, I would have been better off driving my husband to the hospital.
It's the same question the News 4i team has been trying to get answers to for more than a year, putting in several Freedom of Information Act requests for records that would show if there are problems with staffing and equipment. They have been ignored by D.C. Fire.
On March 8th, 2013, FOIA requests were sent by Ms. Tisha Thompson of WRC-NBC News for
It even came up during a March D.C. Council hearing about problems with response times.
So what happened with the requests?
I believe some of those requests were received by mail, and they were sitting literally in a box unopened.
Why can't we get this information?
We've hired a new FOIA officer, so we have hopefully resolved that issue.
We're still waiting for that information. Chief Ellerby says he wants to make changes to address equipment problems and the paramedic shortage, including a possible shift change, which would require D.C. Council approval.
And if we go from 4 shifts to 3 shifts, we'll actually have 400 extra bodies that we can spread through 3 shifts. So it would take almost 80 people to call in sick for them to even begin to impact our operation.
New gear for broken ambulances should arrive this summer, and the department is exploring an internal training program for new paramedics.
Anytime we have these incidents that have a negative outcome, I take it personal.
But Loretta says not as personal as the families left to wonder if a few extra minutes could have made the difference.
If they don't let the people know, how are we to know how to respond to situations when loved ones is at risk for their lives?
Loretta Wheeler lives 7 minutes from the hospital. The department tells us there are roughly 39 ambulances on the streets each day, but only 1/3 carry a paramedic, which is what you need for more advanced life support. Chief Ellerby says he's now getting 2 daily reports on how many units are really on the road and how long it's taking to get to emergencies. Tisha Thompson, Jim, Doreen.
It's one of the most troubled agencies in our region where a mistake can mean life or death.
Tonight, Tisha Thompson and the News 4i team go inside the D.C. Fire and Emergency Medical Services Department to find out what's going wrong and what the chief is now promising to do to fix things. Tisha?
Doreen, D.C. Fire and its labor union have one of the most contentious relationships in the city, with both sides telling very different versions of why things go wrong inside the agency. So, for more than a year and a half, the News 4i team fought a legal battle to get paperwork from the city. We finally got the documents. It's been a rough year for DC Fire.
It was like it's on fire.
Ambulances catching fire. A DC police officer waiting 15 minutes for help after a hit and run.
Yes, we called, but they never came.
And a local man who eventually died after waiting 20 minutes for an advanced life support unit to arrive. Leaving us to wonder, if I'm in trouble, will the right help arrive? The News 4i team has obtained documents that show there are some serious problems inside DC Fire, starting with the sheer number of unfilled positions. According to the DC Firefighters Union, it takes 360 people to fully staff all positions on any given day. The union claims there are as many as 250 unfilled positions. Fire Chief Ken Ellerby says it's actually 96. But according to the staffing records we obtained, the number is more in the middle, 181 vacancies as of June.
The reality is we're in such a hole.
Union President Edward Smith says the city just hasn't kept up with hiring over the last few years. The staffing records show that is the case, with as many as 15 to 20 paramedics leaving each year without being replaced.
My gut reaction is we don't have enough. Way behind.
Why is that important? The fire department says 1 out of every 5 calls requires a paramedic. Smith says only paramedics can intubate a patient, administer life-saving drugs, and use complex defibrillators. Everyone else is an EMT who can provide basic life support like CPR.
You would want that paramedic on the scene as quick as possible. The paramedic has a substantial amount more training.
The city is supposed to have those paramedics on 14 medic units and 21 engines to provide advanced life support. But if there aren't enough paramedics to fill these vehicles, the units are downgraded to a basic life support ambulance or a regular fire engine. Smith says the hardest hit areas are in the city's highest demand areas, in Wards 6 and 7. He says there are now so many unfilled paramedic jobs that the ones who do show up to work are being forced to work 12-hour mandatory overtime shifts after they've finished their regular 24-hour shift. Smith points to this graphic the union has created.
This is July of 2011. So everywhere you see a yellow B is when a unit was downgraded that day. It wasn't actually a medic unit. It was just a regular ambulance.
The number of yellow boxes increases for the same month in 2012 and again in 2013.
Here's a day here, the 8th in the AM. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 out of the 14 supposed medic units that are supposed to be staffed, 3 of them were in. The picture tells the story.
Not quite, says DC's Fire Chief Kenneth Ellerby.
People have to come to work. That'll keep those boxes from turning yellow.
Chief Ellerby says employees only work 96 days out of the year. The city is already investigating why almost a third of all firefighters called out sick this past New Year's Eve. But now, the News 4i team discovered in the city's downgrade documents we obtained, the highest number of downgrades in a recent 6-month period occurred Christmas week. 18 downgrades on Christmas Eve and another 21 on Christmas Day.
People have to come to work. We expect folks to come to work whether it's a holiday or not. And that's just the bottom line. This job requires some sacrifice, and we know that coming in. The pay is good, the benefits are good, and we expect folks to respect the fact that they have a job to do.
Even the chief says it is time for a pay raise, especially for paramedics who are in such high demand throughout the country. But the chief says it's been difficult getting anyone to even apply because of an old D.C. law that also required paramedics to be firefighters.
And a lot of employees who want to be EMS providers don't want to be firefighters.
The chief says he convinced the D.C. government in April to create a variance that would allow him to hire people only as paramedics. Suddenly, he says, the applications started flooding in.
We're not running from this stuff. We know that we can make things better.
The fire chief says in about a week he is going to make a big announcement about hiring a large number of employees and bringing on what he calls an unprecedented number of new ambulances. There are a lot of questions, however, about response times. We've got our hands on every response call in the city for the last 18 months, more than 250,000 calls. Tomorrow at 6, we'll show you what we found. Tisha Thompson, News 4i team.
You're watching News 4 at 6.
The last few months, there have been questions about how long it takes for DC Fire to respond to life and death emergencies.
Tonight, Tisha Thompson and the News 4 I-Team take a hard look at how the agency calculates its response time. Tisha?
Jim, for more than a year and a half, we have been in a legal fight with DC Fire and Emergency Medical Services for documents that would hopefully reveal its true response times. The city has finally handed over the records, giving us a chance to fact check what they've said and to shed some light on what a response time really means.
When you need help, DC Fire is supposed to get there fast. According to medical experts, someone who is not breathing has less than 6 minutes before brain damage or death. Less than 2 weeks ago, DC Fire Chief Ken Ellerby claimed his units respond to calls in 6.5 minutes or less 92% of the time.
We do try to keep the numbers very short and very tight so that we do reduce our response time.
The News 4 I-Team obtained data on all of the calls for DC Fire and Emergency Medical Services from January 2012 until this past May. More than 250,000 vehicles dispatched to the scene of an emergency. At first, we found the data matches much of what the city claimed. But then we discovered some important details that might change the way you look at how the city keeps track of its emergency response times.
You call 911 and a fire engine or ambulance shows up at your front door. That's the time that everybody wants to know.
Edward Smith is the president of the DC Firefighters Association and says he was surprised at what we uncovered. When you call 911, the call taker picks it up at the Office of Unified Communication, or OUC, and sends it to a dispatcher, who then tells the appropriate unit where to go. It's then up to the fire department to get to where it's going as quickly as possible. But we discovered DC Fire only counts the amount of time it takes from the moment a unit is dispatched to when it arrives at your door. It does not include the minutes it takes for your 911 call to move through OUC.
I'm calculating for what we're responsible for, which is time of dispatch to time of arrival on the scene.
According to the chief and his staff, no one in the city keeps track of the entire length of the response, meaning all of these response times could be minutes longer than previously reported.
It's sad. Public deserves to know the truth, and you know, in this age of government, you know, they tout words such as transparency and being collaborative, and we don't see it.
We also noticed there were some very short response times, mere seconds, and incredibly long times, 6, 7, 8 hours in the data. The fire department says these are obviously not right, claiming its system didn't recognize a unit had arrived on scene or a member didn't press the arrival button.
We don't throw out so many outliers that we skew the numbers, but you know, some things are just so short or so extremely long that they would not fall anywhere in the calculation.
So we asked, what do you count? The answer? Any call between 1 minute and 30 minutes.
It's disingenuous. I would call it cooking the books.
Smith says no one had ever told the union the city threw out calls, roughly 8,000 according to our data.
From the documents I've seen from the department, I've never seen that explained in their data sets. So why all of a sudden that comes out now?
Smith says it's very rare for a call to take just 1 minute. That's how long, he says, it takes a crew just to get into a vehicle, or what's called the shoot time. Smith says the only way a call could take 1 minute is if someone walked into a firehouse with an injury or a vehicle happened to be passing the scene on the way to something else. As for calls taking more than 30 minutes?
Rare instances, if you're going from one end of town to the other, even with lights sirens, in rush hour traffic, absolutely it's going to happen.
But the chief stands by the data.
We don't skew the numbers that badly. Those are very, very few and far between, and I will say that our employees have responded to the response time and shoot time challenge admirably. I mean, they do get out the door and they do get to the scene pretty quickly.
The fire chief says he wants the department's response times even lower, but he wouldn't give us a specific goal time, claiming he doesn't want to put too much pressure on his employees. Tisha Thompson, News 4 I-Team.